Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. If I could ask everyone to go ahead and mute their lines. This will just help with feedback as we kind of move forward. To begin with, I am Jacqueline Jones Doyle with the Tarrant County AgriLife Extension Service, and I am Ag and Natural Resources. With us today is Ms. Rachel Howell, Brittany Meyer, and Mr. Chad Cummings, who are also going to be the presenters. We are offering an hour's worth of CEU today. However, in order to receive this hour of CEU, you must be on the live version presentation today, which you are. At the end of the presentation today, I will be posting a link in the chat box for the program survey. In that survey, you'll be asked for your name and your pesticide license number for those that are needing the CEU. If you are going to, but we do ask that everybody does complete the survey for us. That is just part of our job in order to make sure that we can bring quality programs to you for the information that you are needing for your operations or projects. So when you complete the survey, if you do not need the CEUs, just put NA in the name and the pesticide license and then complete the rest of the survey for us. With that being said, I would like to go ahead and turn the program over to Ms. Rachel Howell for our Beekeeping 101 portion.
I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we'll get started.
One other quick note for everyone. If you do have any questions, please be sure to put those in the chat box and we'll relay those to the presenter. And then at the end, we'll allow you to unmute before we go on to the next presenter if you've got any additional questions.
All right, welcome everybody. My talk is about getting started on beekeeping. So we're calling this Beekeeping 101. We are going to talk about all of the steps that you will need to take in order to get started and have a really good experience with your beekeeping. So we're going to talk about educating yourself first, kind of knowing what to expect before you actually get into the bee yard, ordering and purchasing your personal equipment, choosing that, and what exactly do you need. Third is going to be the bee equipment that you'll choose to use. This is your type of boxes, the Langstroth hives, the top bars, things like that. Fourth, we'll talk about how to purchase your bees, where to acquire bees, what's a good idea, maybe what's not a great idea. And finally, if we have some time, we'll go through what your first year with the bees might look like. So we'll roll right into it. Education and research, this really should be your first step before you decide to get into beekeeping. When you do finally get into the bee yard, you're really going to want to know what to do, how to keep yourself safe, and be calm and comfortable with all those bees flying around you. So first thing I recommend is go ahead and grab yourself some really good books. I have one or two to recommend on the next slide. Make sure you're reading those, getting kind of an idea about what is involved in beekeeping before you get out there in the bee yard. Also, learn your local rules and regulations. If you're putting hives out on an ag property, you're not going to be so worried about this maybe, but if you are putting hives maybe in your backyard or in a suburban or even urban location, you're definitely going to want to know what the local rules and regulations are about where you are allowed to put your bees and how close they might need to be or far away from other structures, things like that. And of course, that's going to be individual, so make sure you're looking at your individual rules in your county and city. You'll also want to know what the time commitment is. Typically, you're going to want to be out checking your hives every 10 to 14 days for most of the year. And if you have hives that are out on a piece of property, maybe that's a little bit of a drive away from you, you're also going to want to put that time in of how long is it going to take me to drive there? How long am I going to be there? I have to do this every 1 to 2 weeks. Is this something I can really commit to? Also think about what are the physical requirements. When your bees start putting honey in their boxes, some of those boxes can get to be 60, 70 pounds. and you want to have a plan for how you're going to move those around. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, I can't lift 60 pounds, that's not necessarily going to stop you from beekeeping, but you will have to have a plan to how you're going to work around that. It may be just as simple as you pulling the frames out individually instead of pulling the whole box full of honey. You also are going to want to think about startup costs. As we go through buying your equipment, I'm going to give you kind of an idea of what everything costs. But you're going to want to make sure you have that financial piece in place before you start going, because if you get into it, you've got bees, it's really hard to get out of it if you find that you can't manage either the startup cost or the ongoing expenses. Typically with ongoing expenses, we're going to have things like buying sugar to create syrup, maybe buying some supplements for the bees. You may be buying boxes occasionally to add to your hives. You're also going to, at some point, want to be purchasing honey extracting equipment. That's not something I'm including in the startup cost here because it is going to be about a year before you're ready to harvest any of that honey from your hives. You're also going to want to think about safety implications. If you don't yet know if you are allergic to bee stings, you're going to want to be ready when you get into the bee yard with some kind of Benadryl or maybe even an EpiPen, because if you're not sure, you need to be prepared. Now, that's another thing you're going to want to consider is if you get into the bee yard and find out that you are highly allergic to bee stings, that is going to affect your desire to continue doing beekeeping. So I did say I had some recommendations for reading. If you do nothing else before you start your beekeeping journey, please purchase 1 or 2 books and just do some reading up on it so that you know, like I said, what to expect. The Beekeeper's Bible, this one is a really great book. I use it frequently just to reference when I have questions after I've been in the bee yard. It's just a great thing to have on hand for your entire beekeeping life. The Backyard Beekeeper, this one's a little bit less fully involved than the Beekeeper's Bible, but it's easier for the first-time beekeeper to kind of learn and digest on a lower level. So I definitely recommend those 2 and any others that you might find out there. Now, another thing to do as you're learning, getting educated before you get your own apiary and bees is find a beekeeping mentor or a buddy that you can get into the bee yard with. This is going to be a great idea for you to learn what kind of equipment you like to use best. It's going to be a great idea for you to learn your comfort level around bees. It's definitely one thing to say, I am not afraid of bees when I'm out in my garden and there's 1 or 2 foraging on flowers. It's a completely different thing when you're opening a hive and you have 100 of them flying up and around your face. So definitely make sure before you go ahead and jump in that it's something you're actually comfortable doing and willing to kind of develop comfort with. So some ways that you can find a beekeeping buddy. Check out some of the local beekeeping clubs near you. Here in Fort Worth, we have Metro Beekeepers. Over in Dallas, there is Trinity River Beekeepers or Trinity Valley Beekeepers. You might look into even taking a beekeeping class with them. That can also be attending those meetings that they have, can also be a great way for you to learn about what's involved in the beekeeping hobby. Do some personal networking maybe. Maybe you have some gardener friends who are already beekeeping. Maybe you know someone whose kids are involved or who is involved in volunteering with FFA or 4-H. Maybe look into some of those organizations that can help you learn about beekeeping. You can also go on Facebook, find some of the beekeeping hobby groups in your area. I will say when you go out on Facebook, it takes all kinds to make a world. So you may get someone that you really enjoy working with and you may not. But that is also another way for you to connect with beekeepers and do some learning. And also you can look into the Texas Master Beekeepers Program. This is a program where beekeepers can develop their knowledge, take tests, and move towards becoming a titled master beekeeper. They also do some education out in the community. So if you are maybe wanting to go see a talk, something like that, meet a master beekeeper, there's their website, masterbeekeeper.tamu.edu/master-beekeepers. Okay, we kind of rolled through the education part a little fast. Anybody have any questions at this point?
There's nothing in the chat, Rachel, so I think we're good.
In the chat, thank you. Okay, let's move on to deciding what kind of personal equipment you want and purchasing your personal equipment. You're going to definitely want a suit, some sort of suit, veil, gloves, and we'll talk about what kind of shoes are best for being in the bee yard. You're also going to need smoker, lighter, and fuel, and some hand tools. So with the suit, if you are a brand new beekeeper, I absolutely recommend going with the full suit. The reason being is it takes some time to develop your comfort. Getting stung a lot in your first season of beekeeping can really put a damper on your enjoyment of it. So I would recommend getting a full suit. Some people like the veil on the right. It's kind of a rounded hat style veil, and others prefer what's called the fencing veil here on the left. You can see this one has the zipper to where you can access your face. Not something that I use a whole lot, but I do have this feature on mine and I find it nice. I prefer the fencing veil. Some people will go with just a jacket and veil and maybe wear jeans or some sort of thick pants on their bottom half. That is perfectly fine, but you're definitely going to want to make sure that you're securing the bottom of whatever pants you're wearing, because ankles are one of the first places where the bees are going to get to try and sting. Some people are brave and they only go with just a veil, maybe with a loose fitting shirt, something like that. I don't recommend this because you just never know what kind of mood your bees are going to be in, and if they're feeling stingy, you might be feeling stingy as well. So looking at the pricing here, these are just rough estimates, but you can get a suit anywhere from $85 to $250. Typically the difference there is your $85 suit is going to be just like a painter suit, kind of a canvas material. Upwards of $250, you're going to be looking at ventilated material and probably some reinforced mesh on your veil. I highly recommend in Texas that you do spring for the ventilated suit. It does get really hot. Most of the time that you're working with your bees is going to be spring and summertime. And when you add on top of the 90-degree weather, you're wearing a very large, heavy suit, you're going to get hot very quickly. And if you are someone that tends to suffer from heat-related illness, you're going to want to be very careful when you're out in your bee yard. Now the gloves, those run the gamut of leather and goat skin, going all the way up the arm, all the way down to some beekeepers will just use the nitrile gloves that are made out of kind of a, well, it's nitrile and just kind of a rubber glove feel. Obviously, it's least expensive to purchase a box of the nitrile gloves. Oh, let's go back. But you are least protected with the nitrile gloves. So if you're a beginning beekeeper, you may want to look into purchasing something a little bit thicker. I highly recommend the leather and goat skin. I use that every time I'm in the bee yard because I personally tend to get a very large welt, and that stays for about a week with localized swelling when I get stung. So I don't want to have to deal with that on my hands for an entire week after I've been in the bee yard. So I always go with a leather and a goat skin or something like that so that I know I'm not going to get stung. Now, the drawback with the leather and the goat skin, they are a little bit thicker, so you're going to lose some of your dexterity when you're working in the hives. But I don't find that to be something that's worth getting stung. Again, if you are someone who can get stung and 10 minutes later it's like nothing happened, then you may be fine with using more of a nitrile or some less protective type of glove. Now, I did say we were going to talk about shoes as well. I personally like to use rubber welly boots. They come almost up to my knee, and I can really get a lot of protection from bee stings by covering the boot with the full suit and then securing the suit at the bottom. That way I know for a fact I'm not going to have bees coming up under the shoes. Now you can barely see this guy here has just sneakers on, and he has a kind of elastic around under the bottom. A lot of beekeepers do that, don't have any trouble whatsoever. It's really dependent on your comfort level. What you don't want is a shoe that's very thin that bees could potentially sting through. Moving on to the smoker and lighter and fuel. Smokers, you can find them on the market somewhere around $20. There's not a huge variety in style or quality. I bought a fairly cheap one, and it's been going for years and years. I've been working for 6-7 years, I think, in the bee yard, and I have never had a problem with my smoker. So go ahead and find you Amazon or any of the big box beekeeping stores, pick up a smoker. Lighters, again, you can go anywhere from a box of matches all the way up to a kitchen butane torch. Matches can be tricky because you've got to get your fingers down into the lighter, or into the smoker, excuse me, and you don't want to do that while the smoke is coming up. Get your fingers potentially burned. So I prefer not to use matches. You can also use one of those long candle lighters that you can buy, but I find they run out of fuel really quickly. So I went ahead and purchased a kitchen butane torch, like this one that you see here. You can refill the fuel, the butane fuel, and I find that one refill lasts me almost a whole season in the bee yard. So it's nice to know that I just always have it. If my smoker goes out, I can just grab it and relight my smoker really easily and quickly. Fuel for your smoker. You can purchase pine shavings at your local big box feed store. I went 2 years ago, bought some pine shavings that are meant for like guinea pig bedding or maybe even chicken bedding. That one bale has been keeping me going now for about 2 seasons. So it's a really inexpensive way to light fuel my smoker. Alfalfa pellets do a great job of lighting quickly. So sometimes I'll just throw one of those in there and then use my pine shavings for the rest. Basically anything that is organic and dry you can use in your smoker. So burlap, mulch, dried grasses. It just needs to be dry so that it'll catch for you. Now, hand tools, moving from left to right, are, in my opinion, what you're going to want the most and what maybe is the least important for you to have. A hive tool, this is something that you're absolutely going to need. And I would even recommend that you purchase more than one of these. The reason being is that if you get into a beehive and you find that you've been putting this hive tool down in there and it looks like that particular hive might be sick with a disease, you don't want to use this tool in any of your other hives until you have disinfected it. So it's really, really a good idea to have at least 2 of them when you go into your bee yard so that you know you aren't spreading diseases from one hive to the other. Next one here is a bee brush. Your bee brush is going to be used for kind of pushing the bees off of the frame so that you can get a better look at the frame. I don't use my bee brush most of the time when I am out in the bee yard, but I do find it extremely helpful when I'm harvesting honey because I want to pull those frames out and then brush the bees off before I put the frames in my harvesting box. We definitely don't want to be taking bees with us to the honey extractor. A queen cage is our next one. I find this really helpful. A lot of times you're going to be wanting to find the queen and maybe move her to a different location. You may be trying to requeen. So that means you're going to be trying to find that queen and squish her and put a new queen in. I find these queen cages extremely helpful. What I do is just stick one right in the pocket of my bee suit. It stays there all season long. And when I need it, I just have it right there. Another piece of equipment, not strictly needed, but some people really like to have them. This is a frame holder. The frame holder is used to grab the frame in the hive and pull it out and hold it. And you would squeeze these top pieces together in order to grab onto the frame. I have small hands and I find this to be really, really stressing on my grip, especially once I get a frame full of honey pulled out. So I tend to just use my fingers to hold the frame. But again, if I was using nitrile gloves or something less protective, I might want to be keeping my hands a little further away from the frame. So frame holder is something that you may want to look into getting, or you may find that you don't want to use at all. And again, this is a place where when you are with your beekeeping mentor, you can kind of work it out and see if that's something you like, if it's something you don't like. A frame perch is another useful but not entirely necessary piece of equipment. I like to have it because I tend to get into the bee box, pull a frame out, and set it to the side. If you set it down onto the ground, you're likely going to add moisture to the frame, something the bees don't really do well with. And also you may be inviting pests onto that frame that wouldn't necessarily be in your box otherwise. All right, do we have any questions about equipment before we move on to the bee equipment?
Doesn't look like we do, Rachel.
Okie dokie. I've lost my video view, so I can't see where questions are coming in. Let's move right along. We are making good time. We'll probably have time to talk about a year in beekeeping as well. So your bee equipment, we're going to want to have hive stands, decide what type of box you're going to be keeping your bees in, and then we're also going to talk about location, where you're going to want to be placing these hives and maybe where you don't want to be placing these hives. Here in this picture in the background, this is my apiary. Mine is in my backyard, and so I have it right in the corner of the two fences. This causes my bees to come out of the hives and go up so that they are, they're flying above the fence line. And this means that I'm less likely to run into them when I'm out in the yard or when my neighbors are out in the yard because their flight path has been raised up. Something you might want to think about if you are beekeeping in a suburban area. If you're beekeeping out on a piece of property, an ag piece of property, you may not be so concerned about that. So hive location, our ideal location is going to be away from human movement and traffic. You definitely don't want to be putting the entrance to your hive facing any kind of heavily trafficked area. This will definitely cause the bees to become defensive and cause any of the individuals moving through that trafficked area possibly to be stung. You also want to think about where your hive entrance is facing. It's best if the entrance is facing south or southeast. This is because If they're facing south in the winter, they're not getting the cold north wind blowing up into the hive. In the summer, you are going to have them facing, well, if you have them facing southeast, in the summer, you're going to get a really nice early sunlight into those beehives, and your bees will get up early and start working away. Now, this is, of course, ideal. If you are not able to face your hive entrance in that orientation, it's okay to have them facing west or north. You're just going to have to make some adjustments to the way that you manage your hives to keep your bees comfortable and happy. You would like for your hives to be in a sunny location with some afternoon shade. In the northern climates, they don't need to worry so much about the afternoon shade, but down here in Texas, our bees really are stressed by the heat that we get. So if you can provide them with a little afternoon shade, that will really, really help. Another thing to provide them with is a really close source of water that they can get to, so that they can use that water to cool the hive. If you don't have a sunny location for your hive, again, that is still doable, but you're going to have more of the hive beetles and pest infestations. So again, you'll have to increase your pest management in order to make up for the shady location. We already talked about being near a water source. This is really important for the bees. A lot of people think about the bees needing flowers and nectar and pollen, but they also need a water source. And when I say appropriate for the bees, that means a shallow area or an area with pebbles the bees can land on and drink while they're on a solid surface. Unlike their wasp cousins, bees are not able to land on water and take back off again. So you will need to provide some sort of place for them to land and then access the water. And of course, they're going to need forage resources nearby. So if you are in a urban environment, you're going to want to maybe take a walk around your neighborhood and see what kind of resources there might be. Do your neighbors have a lot of boxwoods that don't produce any kind of flower, or nandinnas? That's going to be pretty limiting for your bees. If your neighbors have other types of shrubs and things that will produce flowers, you're probably going to do a little bit better. If you're out in more of a country environment, not managed environment, chances are really good that your bees are going to have good resources because you're going to have a lot of native plants and shrubs and things like that. Okay, let's talk about what type of box you're going to want to be putting your bees in. The most popular is the Langstroth hive. This is the boxes that we stack vertically, one on top of the other. So we'll start with a bottom board here. Then you put what's called a deep box. Most beekeepers will put a second deep box on before they start adding honey supers, which are a little bit more shallow, same size box, just a little bit more shallow. And of course, we add those honey supers during the honey flow. You'll also want some sort of inner cover and then your outer cover. Having an inner cover is important because it provides ventilation to the hive. Without this, it would create a real kind of stuffy, still environment without letting air flow in. And you can see here on the bottom board, this one is screened, and that also increases ventilation. I highly recommend screened bottom board for beekeeping in Texas because it does get so hot. You can purchase usually a slide-in that goes underneath so that in the winter you can kind of block that off from the cold air as well. Now this over here that I've been showing you is your traditional wooden hive. It's of course the least expensive. But also on the market now is something called an Apimaye hive. It is still in the Langstroth family, meaning that you're going to stack the boxes one on top of each other. But the material that the Apimayes are made out of has a much higher RF value, so it will keep the bees cooler in the summer and warmer in the winter. So it decreases a lot of the stress on the bees. Something to think about if you have the budget. These price points here, this $250 for the Apimaye hive is just for the bottom board, one box, and the top. This pricing here is going to be for your traditional wooden Langstroth, and that is for the entire setup that you see here. So 2 boxes, queen excluder, bottom board, and top and inner cover. It's definitely a little more economical to go with the wooden boxes. That is what I use. When I'm able to, I do want to start using some of these Apimaye to help my bees out. Now, if you're using a Langstroth hive, you're going to want to have some sort of stand to put it on. If you put your beehive directly on the ground, you're going to stifle that ventilation that the bees need, encourage pests getting up into there much more easily, and also add moisture into your hive, which is something that will cause harm to your bees, will be very difficult for them. So here's a couple of different options. This one appears pretty economical. It's just a couple of cinder blocks stacked with some, looks like maybe 4x stringers across, and you just set your beehives right on top. This one down here is, again, a picture of my apiary. It's just a stand built out of 2x4s, fairly economical, and something that lasts quite a long time as well. You can also purchase hive stands. This is one that's metal. It can be adjusted for leveling, which is very nice. One limitation of this type of a stand, though, is that it's going to be knocked over more easily. So certainly if you are out in an open setting where you might have bears or other critters coming by, you might want to think about something that's a little wider, longer, and more stable so that it's less likely to get knocked over. Now, if you're someone who likes to do things a little less traditionally, or maybe you're worried about having to lift those boxes off of the vertical Langstroth hive design, you could go with a top bar or a long Langstroth. So a top bar hive is pictured over here. That is going to be a very natural form of beekeeping. Instead of adding frames and boxes to the top of the hive, you would add to it horizontally this way. So just add frames as the bees need them, and then you can block off and insulate any empty part of the hive when it's not in use. You can also see here that the frames don't really have a foundation to them. The bees will draw out the comb on their own, and that makes it a little bit trickier to harvest your honey with traditional honey harvesting methods. In this method, you would have to harvest your honey by basically squishing and extruding that honey through multiple sieves. Now, the long Langstroth, pictured over here, is kind of a hybrid between your top bar and your Langstroth. You're going to be beekeeping horizontally, so it does take the stress off of having to lift boxes off of the vertical hive. However, it does still use the same frames that a Langstroth hive would use. So when you go to harvest your honey, you can still use all of the same honey extracting equipment that you would use for the Langstroth hive. Now, the big drawback with the top bar and the Langstroth hives, they're quite pricey to purchase. And of course, with the top bar, you'll have to use a bit of non-traditional or not common ways of managing the hives. Okay, let's take a quick break. Any questions?
Nothing in the chat box, Rachel.
All righty, thank you, thank you. So we finally decided what kind of protective equipment we want to wear. We've purchased all of our tools and our boxes, and we're ready for bees. So where do you get your bees? You can purchase them through a commercial apiary. You could take a split from a beekeeper friend, especially if you already have a beekeeping mentor who's already working at it. You could catch a swarm. But whatever you do, try to source your bees as locally as possible. This is because the bees that are already living in your area are going to do better with the climate and the environmental stressors in your area. So if you are going to purchase through a commercial apiary, you could purchase a package of bees. This is, as you see below, it's just the bees. It's a specific weight with the queen included. The pros are that this can be shipped to you and it's the least expensive method of purchasing bees. The cons are that the bees here have no resources whatsoever. So when you put them into a fresh new hive box, it is going to be really hard on them to find resources in their new environment and get to drawing out comb and laying eggs, all while trying to figure out where they've just been moved to and where the resources are. Now, one step up from that is your nuke. Your nuke is, as you see here, it's basically just a small hive or a small box. You get 5 frames with the bees and the queen. The frames will have some resources on them. They'll already be drawn out with comb so that the queen has space to be laying eggs already. It's also most likely going to have some honey in there as well for them to use. So those are great pros. It's also less expensive than a single-story hive, as we'll see over here. And it's easier for your colony to establish than when you purchase a package. The cons are that you have to pick these up in person and transport them back to wherever your apiary is going to be. For some people, that's not a big deal. For others, that could be very difficult, depending on whether you have a commercial apiary source near you. Now, the quickest way to establish your colonies is through your single-story hive. This is basically just a small beehive that you are picking up and bringing home. So the pros here are that the bees already have their home. They've already got 10 or 8 frames in there, depending on what size box you are going with. And they already have the colony established. They're just going to need to get to their new location and find where the resources are there. Another nice thing is that if you purchase a single story, you are not going to need to purchase your foundation, your inner cover, your cover, or your first box, because that is already included in the price of your single story hive. So some nice things there, especially if you're wanting to get going really quickly. It is possible to have a honey harvest your first year if you purchase a single story. Not necessarily a guarantee, but definitely possible. With your other 2 purchasing options, you're certainly going to be waiting a whole year before you go ahead and get any honey off of those.
Rachel, before you go on, we do have a question in the chat box.
Okay.
I'm sorry, but I missed what to do in the heat of West Texas. What type of shade?
It could be that you put your hives in a location where they're at the edge of a tree line, something like that, to where the trees are going to naturally shade in the afternoon as the sun kind of comes over. Or it could be that you put up some poles and maybe run some shade cloth on one side of your hive or the other, so that as the western sun comes over, you get that shade from the shade cloth. You could put them on the side of a building that is going to throw shade in the afternoon. Any of that will work just fine.
Thank you. That's all.
All right. Now let's talk about if you are wanting to acquire bees through catching a swarm or sharing with friends. Now, if you're trying to catch a swarm, always, 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 please put your personal safety first. So if that swarm is 50 feet up in a giant tree, maybe that's not the swarm for you. unless you are a professional arborist or something you have equipment to be getting up that high. If you are not ready with your personal protective equipment, if you're not prepared with your boxes, then catching a swarm might not be the right time for you. Now, that being said, if you find a swarm that is safe for you to access and something that you want to go and get, you're ready with your boxes, that is extremely exciting as a beekeeper. I have caught a swarm before. It just makes you feel really like a professional. It makes you feel like you know what you're doing. So that's something that can be really fun. The other thing to think about is you don't really know the genetics of that swarm. So you always want to be on the lookout for Africanized or even just very aggressive bee populations. That's not something that you want to be working with in a managed hive. Also, when sharing between friends, you want to consider the possibility of maybe spreading disease or pests. So again, if you are working with a beekeeping buddy or a mentor and you know that they're doing a great job of managing their hives and keeping pest and disease low, that's probably a perfectly fine way to source your bees. But if you are out on Craigslist maybe or Facebook ads and somebody says, hey, I've made a split, you want to buyer beware there, because you don't know if you might be getting, of course, poor bee genetics, and also you may be bringing home some pests and disease that you don't maybe necessarily want. Okay, I think we are doing pretty good on time. Yeah, we've got time. So let's go into what your first year in beekeeping is going to look like. We're going to be talking about hive checks, when and how many boxes to add, pest management, how to do that, what to look for, honey harvest, and winter preparation. So let's roll right in. I'm starting our year in review here in April because that is typically when most people are going to pick up and install their colonies of bees. That's usually when the commercial aviaries have them available. When you bring your colony home, put them into your boxes, you're probably going to want to be feeding some sugar syrup for at least the first 2 weeks until they get established, and maybe even longer. You just want to make sure they have a chance to find where the resources are in their new area, and that they have food and resources right inside their hive until they do. You're going to start checking your hives every 10 to 14 days for overall health. I'm not going to go super far into what a hive check looks like, but you are going to want to be getting in, looking at the frames. And this is where, if you've done your education piece beforehand, then you know maybe what you're looking at. You have a better idea of what you're looking for during different seasons of the year. And it really helps you to get an idea of whether your hive is healthy or not. Adding boxes as needed. So when you get your bees home, you're going to put them into the first box. When you see that they have drawn comb, wax comb, in 80% of the frames. So if you have a 10-frame box, if 8 of those frames are fully drawn out with honeycomb and your bee population is filling out a good 7 or 8 of those frames, that's when you're ready to add a second box on. If you are an existing beekeeper and not brand new, you may decide to requeen existing hives in April. This is because April is typically when the queen bees are available for purchase. And you can also, if you're an existing beekeeper, you can make splits to your hives as needed in April. Making a split is just taking one hive and turning it into 2. And again, you would want to have a queen available to give to that second hive that you split. So those are 2 things that not going to be a worry in your very first year of beekeeping. But just so y'all know, April is typically the time when we do that. Moving into May, we're still doing our hive checks every 10 to 14 days, making sure that our population is staying high, we're still seeing eggs and larvae in there, and our hive is growing and free of disease. You may discontinue supplemental feeding if a nectar flow is present. Here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, we typically have nectar flow from April through June. Different parts of Texas may be slightly different. So again, great place to ask your beekeeping mentor or buddy about, hey, how do we know if nectar flow is on? Typically, you start seeing a lot of nectar being stored into the frames. You may want to add your queen excluder at this point if you have 2 deep boxes that are at least 80% full with frames. At that point, you can add your queen excluder and your honey supers, and the bees can start storing the honey that you would be taking off in June. And May, you're also going to want to move solid bottom boards, swap them for screened bottom boards. This will increase the ventilation in the hive and really help the bees manage as the heat comes in May, or possibly even earlier in some parts of southern Texas. In June, we're going to continue checking our hives. We're going to add honey supers as we need, and we're preparing for harvest. Typically, honey harvest happens just as soon as the nectar flow has finished. So when you start to see some of the spring, fresh blooming flowers and things kind of wilting back, not blooming quite so much, that's when you're going to be looking to harvest your honey. In late June, early July, you're going to be harvesting your honey. And from here on out, everything is preparation for winter. So after you harvest that honey, we're continuing our regular hive checks. We're going to resume supplemental feeding in what we call the summer dearth. Typically in Texas, we get into July and it's so hot that nothing's blooming or very little is blooming. So our bees are kind of short on nectar. We just took all their honey off the hive. So we're going to supplemental feed them with some sugar water so that they can store that sugar water honey for winter. Also in July, right after you've done your honey harvest, you're going to check for varroa mites and do treatments if needed. Varroa mites are the #1 pest that cause colony collapse, and keeping them at bay is going to be absolutely critical for your long-term success. Now moving from summer into fall, in August, it is hot, hot, hot. We're checking our hives every 10 to 14 days. What we're looking for is for them to start storing back honey in their 2 bottom boxes. We've already took the supers off. So we're going to be looking for about 30 pounds of stored honey after the harvest. How do you know what 30 pounds is? A full box of 10 frames with completely drawn out stored honey is going to be 60 to 70 pounds. So if we cut that in half, we're looking at 5 frames, both sides filled with honey in your deep boxes. If you've done a mite treatment back in July, you're going to remove that treatment if it was placed. And if the hive is exceptionally strong, you might consider adding a 3rd deep box just to make sure they have plenty of space to continue expanding. And if your bees do not have that 30 pounds of honey stored back in their boxes yet, we're going to continue our supplemental feeding. Moving into September, we're still doing our hive checks. I really hit on this every month because it's very important that we're doing this every 10 to 14 days. Things can go south with a hive very, very quickly. And if you have let it go 20, 30 days, you may be looking at a declining hive that can't be saved. If our bees don't have that 30 pounds of stored honey yet, we're going to continue feeding them. Sometimes in September, we'll have a second short nectar flow. So if you start seeing some more flowers blooming, maybe the goldenrod, things like that, you can probably cut back on the supplemental feeding. It's cheaper for you if you don't have to do the feeding, and it's more natural for the bees if they can get it from their environment. So if you do have a nice fall honey flow, you might just go ahead and let the bees take that for their 30 pounds of stored honey. In October, we're still checking our hives. We're not adding honey supers. Well, I apologize, y'all. I guess I have not altered this October, but we are still checking our hives in October. Again, we're making sure that we have the 30 pounds of stored honey in the 2 deep boxes that they have left. We're preparing for winter, so maybe we're going to start reducing our hive checks to maybe 20 days so that the bees can start propolising and getting things kind of sealed up for winter. In November, we're still reducing our hive checks just a little bit if we know that they have their 30 pounds of stored honey and that their population is still looking really good. Bee population, when you look down into your hive, you want to see that at least 5 or 6 frames are completely covered and full of bees. If you don't have at least 5 or 6 frames completely covered, you're looking at a weak hive, and you may have to do some management to help them make it through the winter. Having reduced brood is the eggs and larvae that you see in the hive, is going to be completely normal at this time of year. Much like chickens, the queen bee will stop laying or very much reduce her egg laying when the sunlight hours decrease. And this is because they don't need to be increasing bee population as they're coming into winter, and they know that they're going to need to rely on stored resources and not need so many worker bees out foraging. Insulating is not necessary. Fortunately for us here in Texas, our winters typically don't get bad enough to need insulation for the hives. If we feel we may have a very cold winter, or it starts getting cold really early, you may think about just covering the base of your hive stand so that air can't move up and into the bottom. In December, moving into winter, you do not want to be opening your hives if daytime temperatures are not at least 60 degrees or higher. This is because opening the hive when temperatures are low could result in chilling the brood, which would kill any baby bees or larvae that you have in there. You want to monitor food stores as the weather permits. So when you do get a nice day in December, we're going to get out into the hives and we're going to check to make sure they still have enough food storage, nectar and pollen and honey stores in there. Now is the time, if you want to expand your apiary, to get out on the internet, do some pre-ordering of your bees so that you are ready to get going in the spring. January is, of course, when our year begins again. As the daylight starts to get longer, the queen will start to lay more eggs, and she is going to start ramping up for the season again. You may also see the bees start to bring pollen into the hive on warm days. When it's warm enough, they're going to be out flying, trying to find some resources, and it's a great sign if you can see them bringing pollen into the hive when you go out to check. If you don't see them bringing pollen in, or you're not happy with the amount of pollen brought in, you can consider feeding pollen patties. That's just a synthetic feed for the bees. Pollen, some of it is natural as well. Pollen is the kind of protein that they use to feed the baby bees. And as the queen is ramping up her egg laying, they're going to have to start feeding that brood with something. So that's why the pollen is extremely important at this time of the year. Now, if your food stores are getting low as you're checking them, you may want to begin feeding small amounts of syrup, but you'll want to keep that syrup fed in external feeders. If you put a large amount of liquid inside your hive, and then we get a really cold snap in January, that liquid could freeze, and that's going to make it really hard for the bees to maintain warmth inside their hive when they have a giant brick of ice. So we want to make sure that if we are feeding in the wintertime, we're keeping that feed outside the hive where it's not going to affect the temperature on the inside. In February, we want to continue to monitor, make sure they're bringing in pollen, make sure they have plenty of pollen and honey stores as the weather permits. They're going to be going through a lot of these pollen and honey stores because the hive is growing extremely rapidly with the queen ramping up her egg laying. That means that if your bees haven't been going through their stores very quickly, say back in December, you're going to start noticing them eating them up very quickly in February. So you want to be feeding pollen patties and syrup in, again, external feeders as needed. In March, the hive population is at its peak, or it's about to be at its peak. You're going to want to be ready and have your boxes ready to go so you can start adding those. Some beekeepers will even start adding supers as early as late March, depending on how quickly the hive population is ramping up and whether we've got an early spring with things kind of blooming. You can do hive splits in March if you can find available queens for purchase. As we talked about before, typically April is when your bees are available for purchase, so it can be hard to find a queen in March. But if you can do it, you can go ahead and make that split. You could also go the natural route and allow the split to raise their own queen. She will then go out and mate with drones. At that point, though, you don't know what your hive genetics is, so you're going to want to be monitoring that hive for any kind of aggression or Africanized type of genetics coming in. Again, we're monitoring for, well, not again, we're monitoring for signs of swarming, and we're preventing swarming by adding boxes or splitting hives.
Rachel, before you move on, we've got a question in the chat box.
Okay.
I was wondering what treatment you were doing in June. Also, are you supplementing with pollen too, or just sugar water?
In June, I'm typically not supplementing in June with any kind of feed because the honey flow is usually on. Did that answer the question, or were we talking about another month?
As far as it didn't give a month, as far as for the supplemental feeding, it did ask, but he did ask about treatments in June.
Treatments for varroa mites after we've harvested. There's several available on the market. Oxalic acid is one that you would use kind of a fuming spray to put into the hive. A lot of beekeepers like that one, and some beekeepers really don't because it is a synthetic kind of a pesticide type of treatment. You can also use strips called Apivar or HopGuard. What I've been reading personally recently is Apivar seems to be the most effective, and HopGuard can be effective, but usually when the brood is very, very limited.
HopGuard 3 question?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. I think that got it.
Yeah.
Can you give a simple description of how to split a hive?
Yes, absolutely. So if you get in there, let's say it's March, you got into your hive and it's really strong. You've got a whole lot of bees and a whole lot of resources. What you're going to do is set up a second box, an empty one, or maybe one that's been used before, and you're going to pull about 50% of the bees and resources from the existing strong hive, put them into the new box that you've set up. You're going to want to find your queen and keep her in the old box. That way, the new box that you've just added resources to, you will either let them raise their own queen, or you will add a new queen that you've purchased to that box. So the point is that we're taking all of the resources from the strong hive and splitting them in half. That means half of the stored honey, half of the brood and eggs that you find are also going to go in there, as well as any of the bees that are on the frames that you're moving over. Did that do it for you? Did that answer?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
All right. Let's see, we're just about finished here in March. We are monitoring for signs of swarming. We talked about splitting, and you're going to be getting ready to put your supers on. So you want to go ahead and check the supers that you have in storage. Make sure that you don't have any kind of wax moth infestation or any other kind of infestation in there. Now, if you do have some sort of infestation in your stored supers, you're going to want to put those frames in the freezer if you have freezer space available. If you do not, you may have to destroy that frame, because the wax moth, what they do is lay their eggs inside. The larva will come out and eat up all of the wax and other things in your supers. So wax moths, they're just awful. The best way to take care of an infestation is to freeze them, and that will kill any adults or wax moth larvae that might be hiding in your frames. All right, that concludes my presentation. Are there any other questions?
It doesn't look like we have any other questions at this time.
Okay, thank you all.
Thank you, Rachel. That was very informative. So for our next part of the program, we are going to move on to the habitat, or planning the habitat, with Miss Brittany Meyer. Brittany, are you ready to share your screen? And you're still muted, Brittany.
Yes, I gotta find where that screen.
We can see your presentation,
Okay,
or we could, can't now.
yes, I know. I'll get there. I can function, I swear. Okay, let's try that again. So all good now?
Yes, you're back up.
Okay. So not only do you need to have all the proper equipment for housing your lovely bees, but also having the right habitat and plants and for your bees is also incredibly important. So when designing for our pollinators, you need to include plants that bloom at all different times, not just early spring. They desperately need food during the summer months and fall months as they prepare for winter. Color variation is key, though we are talking about bees. We're also wanting to get all of our pollinators into our yards and doing their pollination thing. Woody plants, most people don't think about those because they just think about flowers and our spring flowers and wildflowers coming up, but woody plants are extremely important for our pollinators. And then keeping flower structure in mind. You know, different flower structures allow different pollinators to come get pollen and nectar. And flowers are not the only thing. We need shelter, and as Rachel had spoken about, is a water source as well. So planting for those year-round blooms. Not all pollinators are out and about in spring and summer, and also you need to plant for super early spring to get your hives going. So you're going to check for bloom times. Pollinator.org has a lot of good guides. The Xerces Society and Texas Smartscapes has a lot of resources for you, so you can look at those bloom times for our native wildflowers. Color. Different pollinators prefer different flower colors. Honeybees can also be a little picky with their flowers. So yellow and white are what our honeybees, and also oranges are what they're looking for. Purple and blues are for our little fat bumblebees. Orange and pinks for our butterflies. And then having a red with a contrasting center, so a red petals with a yellow center, is what our lovely honeybees are looking for. So as I said, flower structure and flower types are really important. Open access like this flower up here is going to allow any and all pollinators to gather that pollen and nectar. It's a nice little landing pad for a lot of our bigger pollinators, like our bumblebees and our butterflies. Nice place for them to rest. And then you have the restricted access shapes. Those are more targeted for certain type of butterflies and bees. Like these more tubular shaped flowers, those are going to be for butterflies, moths, some of our honeybees, and of course our hummingbirds. So those are more directed towards very certain pollinators, and more accurate pollination happens. With our open access flowers, those need a lot of visitors to achieve pollination. So that is why they allow any and all to come and take a sip of their nectar. Also finding correct host plants for our pollinators. Essential for survival of a lot of our butterflies, like monarchs. They need to have that milkweed to survive. There's also, certain types for individual insects. Honeybees can be, like I said, can be a little picky with what flowers they choose. They like to have a little more open access flowers, and they like them in that yellow and orange red colors. And if you are not sure what host plants you need for the pollinators you are trying to attract, of course, you can contact your local extension office or your master gardeners. And then also the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower website is also a really great resource. So not only do our pollinators need host flowers, they also need host forage. So this first picture is a queen caterpillar on a milkweed. This is also great for our monarchs. Monarchs need that toxicity from the milkweed for their babies to survive, for their caterpillars to survive. And then you have a Gulf frilary little caterpillar on a passion vine. If anyone has ever seen a passion vine in early spring, you will see a ton of these guys out and about. And then a black swallowtail on rue. Swallowtails also love dill and fennel. They will go after that like nobody's business. So when you're thinking about planting for these pollinators, if you have a small garden or even a large piece of land, think about what these pollinators are going to need for their eggs and caterpillars. But even honeybees need some kind of foliage for their life cycles. So then you need to think about nectar and pollen, like we said, with the flower structures and what type of flowers that are honeybees or any kind of bees, birds, butterflies, even ants are great pollinators, are going to need. Flowers have evolved over millions of years next to these native pollinators. So they know which pollinators they want to attract. And that is why their flowers look the way they do. So, as Rachel was talking about with those bee boxes, if you want to attract other pollinators or native bees that are out and about that don't always produce, they produce honey, but not enough for us to harvest. But it's nice to have other pollinators out and about. So making sure you have some kind of shelter. And even with our honeybees, you know, in the middle of the summer in West Texas, when it's 115 and the sun is beating down, having some kind of canopy tree or shrubs for your beehives is crucial so they're not overheating in those hives. You can also leave a little what most people would consider a mess. So logs, twig, bundles, and leaves. Having nice grass or leaves around your hives will help cool the air around it because that's going to absorb more of the heat and can cool the area around your hive up to 30 degrees sometimes. Rocks and bare soil is also great for our native pollinators. Then you also have handmade or artificial habitats, like this little bee house right here is great for all of our native pollinators. They love that. And as Rachel said, the shelter should be south to southeast, east facing. So more nesting sites for our native pollinators. You have bare patches for our ground bees, our bumblebees, those big fat happy ones. Bricks and dried mud bricks, if you just have some extra lying around that have these openings, is great for our little native bees to create nests in. You can also create nest blocks like this little habitat up here, and you can buy a bee nest kit as well. Just a brush pile. If you have brush piles laying around in your yard or your pastures, before you burn them, check for any kind of bees or any pollinators hiding out in there before you just do your routine brush maintenance. And it doesn't have to be fancy. My master gardeners here in Tarrant County do a lot of bee house building, and we've done these little houses with kids, and it's just a paint can, or you can even do a tin coffee can with some biodegradable material. We have pine cones. These are what you get from the fast food restaurant to hold your drinks. Paper towel rolls, shredded paper. It doesn't have to be fancy, but having that shelter and providing that source for our native pollinators will help draw them in. The saying, if you build it, they will come, that's exactly what this is. So talking about water sources, you can buy these cute little bee cups. If you've ever been to the Fort Worth Botanic Garden, they have a huge display of bee cups that are in this beautiful mosaic pattern. But if we're talking about large hives, doing a bird feeder that has rocks in it, so those bees can climb in and out. They can land on the rocks, get a drink of water, and then fly away because, as Rachel said, they cannot land on water and then fly away. You can also do a hummingbird feeder is really great. It's a nice place for them to land, to just fill this with water. You don't need to fill it with sugar. You can do just water, and it's perfect for our native pollinators. You can also create what's called puddling. So natural putting area, you can just dig a little shallow depression in the ground, and essentially create like a little mud pile, but you're adding in some kind of nutrients to it. So you might put in like a salt block or something. So as that water evaporates, it leaves behind those salts and minerals for our pollinators. You can also create it in a dish. If you don't want to just dig a hole in your yard, you can create a little dish with a terracotta plant pot as well, or a bird bath, and just fill it with, again, water, decorative landscape stones, or just mud. It's great area for our pollinators and bees to land on. Pollinators, other than wasps, need to have something to land on other than straight water. They can't fly away from that. So other types of shelters are food and water sources, basking areas, rocks or logs, patches of bare ground. This is kind of one of those pollen patties that Rachel was talking about that you can put out for supplemental feeding and sugar sources as well, in these little baskets that you can get at a lot of the feed stores or box stores. And then again, just bare ground for a lot of our pollinators is great. They love it, or just nesting sites. So remember, provide food, shelter, and water. Variety of plants is key, and let nature be nature. So now that we've gone over the basics of what you need for your pollinators, what should you plant? What are some great plants for our North Texas area, or even this is just Texas in general, really? Mealy blue sage. Sages are the end-all be-all of pollinator plants. They are great for butterflies and bumblebees. Our honeybees love them to death as well. They bloom for 8 to 9 months. They come up in the spring. They last all summer long in the heat of the summer with little to no water supplemental water. They're great drought plants, and they're beautiful in the landscape for the blue sage. And then you have autumn sage as a nice bright red color. It's very hardy of the sages. Again, these are plants that are Texas tough. They're Texas superstar plants. They are built for Texas. Turk's cap is a great one for full sun or shade. If you want to provide a more shaded area for your pollinators and your bees to get some nectar and pollen throughout the year that's not in full sun. Also, hummingbirds love this. Out at the Fort Worth Botanic Garden, I've sat out there and watched hummingbirds essentially fight each other for these Turk's caps. And the honeybees just like swoop around and get ignored because the hummingbirds are fighting each other. And it's really fun to watch. This plant is, again, a Texas native. It will propagate extremely quickly. So you can have one small plant, and next thing you know, within a couple of months, you'll have a whole hedge of them. And if you think it's getting out of control, you can butcher this plant to the ground and it will come back. So you don't have to be careful with it. You don't have to provide it a bunch of water. If it is in full sun, just a little bit of water during the heat of the summer, just so it doesn't completely wilt. Other than that, you can just let it do its thing. So Zexminia, that yellow color for our bumblebees. This loves the heat. The hotter, the better. It looks a little, gives you that little cottage kind of look, English cottage, a little wispy look. And during the summer months, this is the go-to for our honeybees and our native pollinators. And of course, our native lantana. So our native lantana is the orange-red color. Our native lantana is great for hummingbirds and butterflies, but also a great source for our bumblebees as well. So there's tons of different colors of lantana on the market, but this lantana is what you're looking for to attract more of our pollinators. All the other colors are great as well. They're beautiful. They perform the same, but this is going to attract more pollinators than anything else. Purple coneflower, or as many people know it as echinacea. This is a beautiful plant that flowers in the spring, and then as the cone head dies and leaves the empty stalks, don't cut these down until again early spring, because the stalks become hollow and are great places for our native bees to lay their eggs and for these eggs to overwinter and start emerging in the springtime. So these plants, might have a little more of a wild look to your landscape, but they serve a purpose even in the fall and winter months when they're not as pretty as most people would think. This is one of my favorites, mist flower, blue or Greg's mist flower. Butterflies are obsessed, but so are our honeybees. I have a colleague that has this in her front yard, and she showed me a video to where it looked like the entire plant was moving because there are so many bees on this in the middle of the summer. It is a great go-to nectar and pollen for our honeybees, so you can get that nectar or that honey harvested before, I think Rachel said June. And then also helps to prepare them for the winter months. So talking about fall blooming plants, a lot of people get this in their turf grass and they consider it a weed, but it is one of our best fall flowering plants for our pollinators, especially our honeybees when they're preparing for winter. So will come up, and as most people see it in their yards, it's thousands of blooms all at once, and then it goes away and it's done. But it is beautiful. It's great for late fall blooming. And again, we're trying to get blooms that are not just at the same time. We want them spring, summer, fall, and a few in winter. And this will still come up in December time when we haven't had a freeze yet. So our Texas sage, or what it's also called is barometer bush, this blooms when there's even a hint of possible rain. If there's a dip in the air pressure, this will bloom. So that's kind of how you can tell when it's a little more humid outside, a little heavier pressure in the air. Bees go crazy for this one. It is perfect little landing spot. Right here on this flower, those little dots are there to guide the pollinators, especially the bees, into those flowers for pollination and to get the nectar out. So this is another plant that this also will bloom when it's colder outside, when our bees are preparing for winter, our early spring, so they can get that pollen for their protein and nectar for the sugar. Guara. So this is another fun, spindly looking plant that has pink and white mix of blooms throughout. It depends on the flower. It could be a nice pretty mix, or as you can see in some of these pictures, it's a complete half and half, or even possibly a complete white bloom. Another great one for our pollinators, as you can see, it has a really open pollination, open access, so any and all pollinators can access it. Another great clover, there's also red clover that is great for all our pollinators, and this is a bee favorite. If you've never had red clover honey or clover honey in general, this is one of the plants where that comes from. And this is another Texas native, and it's beautiful. It has a fun, different kind of shape to its flower to add to your landscape. And like I said, it is a bee favorite. So this is great for a shaded area. This Gulf Coast Picinum, I cannot talk apparently. So it's great for also areas that you have in your yard or your pasture landscape that holds a little bit more water. Instead of trying to, add, build up that area with water, this is great to add to help soak up that water. And it's great for shaded areas, again, giving our bees and pollinators an area that might be not in the direct sunlight to kind of give them a nice break from our Texas heat. Wine cups. We've seen these. They grow along this side of the roads. They're beautiful. During the heat of the summer, they do need a little supplemental watering, but they are that open access flower that our bees love because they can land quickly, get what they need, and fly off, or it's a good place for them to rest when it's a little warm outside. Now these guys, sundrops, the hotter, the better. Put them next to an area if you have a driveway somewhere or an area that gets a lot of afternoon sun. The hotter they are, the more blooms they will produce. And these don't need supplemental watering. These are, plant them and neglect them kind of plants. And our honeybees love it because they're that bright yellow color. So of course, for our monarchs, we have our milkweeds. You have green milkweed, antelope, horn milkweed, cycluster, and butterfly milkweed. Now you'll see tropical milkweed. Make sure you're looking at the label when you're buying. Tropical milkweed does not bloom at the correct time of the year, and it completely disrupts the monarch. What is it? When they travel from Canada back to Mexico, and so they'll land a little too early because these bloom during the winter months. So we want them to make it all the way to Mexico and not stop prematurely because now we're disrupting their migration. That is the word I was looking for, migration patterns. And when they lay their eggs on these in November and the eggs, they hatch in December and we get a hard freeze, that's an entire generation of monarchs that we're losing to freeze. So make sure when you're buying milkweed, it does not say tropical milkweed. If you have tropical milkweed in your yard, it's fine. Just when it starts blooming in late fall, early winter, cut those blooms off. Take them inside. Use them as a great bouquet flower for inside. So this is from Texas Smartscapes, and it's a great little handy the visual of what time these plants will flower, if they're low to medium water usage, and great little visual and infograph on those for our bees. And then another great one for butterflies as well. And this is all on Texas Smartscapes website. And I know I went through that super quickly. I had about 30 minutes. So if there's any questions, let me know.
I don't see any questions in the chat box at this time, Brittany.
Okay. Some great resources and places to get native seeds is Native American Seed Company, Bamert Seed, Turner Seed, and a lot of you'll be able to find native nurseries around your area, looking at your water districts. So like Tarrant Regional Water District has a great website where you can find nurseries that sell these native plants. Okay, with that. On
Great,
to
thanks,
you.
Brittany. Continuing kind of with the same patterns, we'll go ahead and ask Chad to go ahead and give his presentation. That way we will kind of cover everything in terms of B101 to habitat and now to pest management. And then I will round out, once he's through, I'll round out the last of the program with ag valuation for your beekeeping. So with that being said, Chad, I'll turn it over to you, and you are still muted.
Thank you for that. Can you all see my screen all right?
Yes, you're good.
Okay. Just wanted to make sure I'm one of those fellas that has the double screen, so I wanted to make sure which one it was showing up on. All right. I get the extreme pleasure today to talk about how we can help our pollinators, and in particular our bees and honeybees, to really ward off any of the problems and pests that come to bother them. I'm going to kind of start out just by introducing myself. I am a graduate of Oklahoma State University. Went there for a few years back in the 90s and early 2000s, and started off in agronomy and crop production, and then actually moved to weed science and finished up in conservation science. Within that, we were talking a lot about invasive species ecology, and also working with prescribed fire to allow us to be able to get some invasive species management. Worked for 14 years with Dow AgroSciences and then later Corteva AgroScience through a name change, and specifically looked at herbicides in primarily range of pasture, DOT and other pipeline management, forestry, and then winter cereals. And then within that discipline, I worked a lot with habitat management, both from a wildlife and livestock species standpoint, but also with some of our pollinators, some of our wildlife that are less game type and otherwise more for just enjoyment. And the pollinator side, of course, more for just making sure that we keep a biodiverse population out there. And then back in April of 2022, I started with the Extension Service here in Grayson County, and my specialties are ag and natural resources. But along the way, kind of in the interim time, I also taught entomology, or the study of insects and arthropods, at Collin College, and wildlife management and habitat management at Texas A&M Commerce. So very happy to be with y'all today, and wanted to talk about a couple of different things. First, we're going to talk just briefly about insect anatomy. Me being an old entomology professor, I can't get away from it, but there's a couple of reasons that we're going to talk about that, and I'll get into it in a moment. We're also going to dive in very deep to the pests of bees and beehives. Miss Rachel talked just briefly about a couple of these. We're going to look at them in a little bit more in depth, and also talk about some of the treatments that we can do, both from a chemical control or chemical prophylactic treatment, and also from an integrated pest management standpoint, where we use all the tools in the toolbox to our ability to help. I'm also going to discuss just briefly all of the different ways that we can use pesticides in the environment. And please understand that we in the agricultural sector absolutely have to use pesticides to be able to feed the populations of the world. But what we can do is try to minimize the impact to non-target species as much as possible. We're going to talk about that very intensely, and just some of the ways that you can do it at home, as well as ways that we promote it from the agricultural extension standpoint, and we do that on a regular basis. So let's get into a little bit about anatomy. These are just a couple of pests that we'll talk about more in general, but there are two that are from different classes of arthropods. And so even though shape-wise they may seem a little bit similar, when we start to look at some of the fine details, we'll start to see some of those differences. With all insects, we're going to actually have a group of parts of those bodies, and bees are no exception. We're going to break those into the head, the thorax, and abdomen. And actually, when I taught entomology, I actually had some little lapel pins made out of that. And that's kind of a key note to be able to identify some of our insects. And then within a lot of our insects, we do actually have a set of wings, or maybe one set of wings. Some have two, like our bees. But we also have mouth parts, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that as well. But just remember that in insects themselves, we typically see 6 legs, and we typically see a set of antennae, and then we will likely have a set or 2 of wings. They may be useful wings that can be utilized for flight, but they may also be very hard or leathery wings that actually serve the purpose of protection as well. We'll learn a little bit more about that later. All right. When we talk about mouth parts, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here, but I did want to point out a few differentiating factors. Of course, with our bees, we have a siphoning and lapping type mouth part, and our butterflies, of course, have a true siphoning mouth part. With many of our biting insects, those are going to be either biting and sucking type mouth parts, or they're going to be more mechanical type munching like we would see in a grasshopper. Those types of mouth parts are actually very, very historic and have been around for a very long time. Some of our earliest insects would have those types of mouth parts. And of course, our good friends, the roaches, that are going to stay around even after the nuclear apocalypse comes someday, they of course have a nice kind of biting mouth part that munches and scrapes. So very, very interesting. And you can kind of put insects into different patterns and different ways, depending on what their mouth parts are as well. So I wanted to point out just a few small differences when we start talking about the arachnida. That's a class of insects, or arthropods instead, that we do have to worry about quite a bit within the beehive management. Of course, our varroa mites fall into this one. There's a few differences that I want to point out, and that can kind of help with identification when we have these insect invaders as well. You'll notice that in most, if not all, of our arachnids, they will have 8 legs as adults versus the 6 legs that we see in the insect world. Many times, many of the nymphs will actually have 6 legs. Even ticks, as they're young, will have 6 legs, and then they morph into their adult stage and they gain an extra set of legs. Many of these are going to have incomplete metamorphosis, so even the young will very closely resemble the adult stages, and so many times those nymph stages will be just as detrimental and damaging as what the adult stages are. Within the arachnida, in most cases for mites and ticks, you're going to see a combined structure of that head, or sorry, of that thorax and abdomen into one big conglomerate group. They will typically have a set of eyes and a mouth part, but then behind that, the pronotum and everything underneath it is all going to be in one big section. And then the legs, of course, are going to be go into the body on that section as well. Most of these mites, ticks, scorpions, spiders, many of these are going to lack wings. They don't even have really any protective type wings, leathery wings as well. So just some major key differences. I will also point out that within the arachnida, we have a lot of very beneficial players, but we also have many of our most common agronomic and human pests in this group of insects, or arthropods, sorry, as well. So digestive system. Now, I wanted to just slap this slide up here, but not go into it in detail. The main reason that I wanted to bring it up is that when we utilize chemical components for insect control or insect growth regulators, many times those chemicals are going, even if they're organic chemicals, are going to act on an insect or an arthropod in different places. It may be from the circulatory system, it may be with the digestive system. Many of them, the insect growth regulators, will actually not allow that nymph or young larval stage to morph into its adult stage or morph past a certain point. And then many of these will also keep the insect or the arthropod from having a reproductive success. So there's just a lot of different ways that many of these insecticidal agents will act on a pest. So let's ask, what is a pest? We really have to think about that because a lot of times what we describe a pest as will differ depending on our point of view and our perspective. Within the homeowner world, of course, many of the moths and crane flies that fly around our front doors or back doors when the lights are on, those would be a pest. But in the same way, those can also be good pollinators. They might be good for other insect control. And so many times what's a pest in one situation or one environment may be a beneficial insect in another. A lot of the pests that we're going to talk about today are actually just full-on pests, whether they're invaders from outside the U.S. In many cases, or they're from here, but because we have changed the format of how we have bees in the environment, and we now have a controlled setting that is accessible to many of these pests, we've kind of changed that environment such that we can't keep the pests away as well as some of the natural populations can. And so that's on us, and we have to be able to manage around that as well. And so really, we just want to make sure that we can do that. That's a very important factor. I am using a lot of information off of the Texas Apiary Inspection Service. That's operated through the Texas A&M AgriLife Research Service, and they have a great amount of information on there, both related to pests themselves, but also just beehives and beekeeping in general. And then they have a lot of good links to other research sources as well. So definitely want to promote them if nobody else was going to. All right, so some of the pests that we've kind of briefly discussed. Varroa mites. I've talked to some of our apiary managers here in North Texas, in Grayson County and Fannin County. And varroa mites in our geography have to be one of the worst problems that they fight with, and really can take a colony down in a hurry. I know that Rachel pointed this out just briefly, but definitely something that we need to worry about, and something that we definitely have a problem with on a regular basis. They are initially from Asia. Used to be just a problem in Asian honeybees, but then have started to get into European honeybees, and definitely have been spread across the world now, and very problematic, of course. They definitely spread from one colony to another when bees interact. And of course, the mites will adhere to both adults and the pupal stages of our beehives. And so they really are a major problem. You'll notice on the bottom there, we talk about a couple of different things. When an infecting colony begins to decline, many of those robbers will actually come in and steal honey, but at the same time, they're also getting infected with those varroa mites. And so definitely, as a beekeeper, if you have more than one box, you really have to monitor that, as Rachel pointed out, 10 to 14 days, really inspecting that box for any of these invaders, and try to make sure that when you do get those, you do quarantine them, and make sure that you get some treatments lined up. Also, care should be taken when they're interchanging frames. If you are going from one box to another, or you're going from one site to another, you really have to be cognizant of where those frames have been and what they have potentially on them. So that close inspection is very important. We'll talk more about the chemicals for control and then that integrated pest management here in a moment. But I just wanted to cover some of these major pests before we got too deep into it. We talked a little bit about the wax moths, and I'll get to that here in a moment. But we also have small hive beetles that can infect some of these hives. This is a species in the Coleopteran order. And so these are larval stages, but then they grow up into being that beetle that I showed a little bit earlier that was on the top. It's kind of a dung beetle looking beetle. And the adult stage is not that problematic, but when they get in and lay eggs in these hives or around them, and then the larva can get into the hive itself, it becomes very problematic. It can really start to do some damage to the hives themselves. These larvae are going to be feeding on almost all the components of the hive, and they are really attracted to the hive, so they can smell them out. Really, cleanliness, sterilization, making sure that when you get equipment out and start putting it into the hives, that you're double checking for any kind of egg masses or any kind of larval infestation already. We want to make sure that those are all taken care of. We also need to make sure that old equipment and dead outs are at least disposed of or not kept in the same geography, because a lot of times those can be a haven for the small hive beetle and many of our other invaders as well. Wax moths, of course, we talked just a little bit about those in Rachel's talk. Really, the most destructive stage is the caterpillar itself. These are a moth that basically will come in, lay eggs. As Rachel pointed out, many times they're a problem in those storage or possibly even in the supers. When you have kind of a dormant time for that super, you really have to be cognizant of what's in there, and cleanliness and sterilization is a key. Rachel pointed out that some of the more cultural, if you want to call it that, control mechanisms would be to put these supers in a freezer at below freezing temperatures for at least 36 hours, and that will kill many of the larvae if they're there, and it will also sterilize the eggs. And so we can really get a good way to minimize the impacts of these wax moths in doing so. And we'll talk a little bit more about this one from an IPM standpoint as well. There are a couple of diseases that I just wanted to bring up and make you all aware of. I am by no means a plant or animal physiologist or pathologist, but I do want to make sure that you all are aware of these. American foul brood is one, and this one is actually reportable to the Texas Apiary Inspection Service. If you find out that you do have this one, definitely need to fill out that report or send an email to them. It's a bacterial disease. It is both European and African honeybee species. It infects the larva. It infects that honeycomb look, and you'll see a lot of sunken or perforated cell caps, and it kills the prepupa and pupal forms of the honeybees. It gets the name because of the foul smell that comes along with it. Many times the smell that you smell will be somewhat similar between American and European foul brood, but I will say from all reports that American is much worse smelling and is definitely the bigger issue from a hive collapse than what the European is. Just a quick description of that one. Not as much of a problem in American honeybee production. Still kills the developing larva, but it does not necessarily impact the pupal or prepupal stages. And like I said, not nearly as infectious as the American foul brood. And in the case of this one, we don't report it. So making sure that you can identify between the two is going to be important. So I was talking with one of our local apiary managers. Wanted to make sure that y'all remembered there's more than just insects and arthropods. There's more than just diseases. There are invaders in the ecosystems that are still problematic. Fire ants would be one of the really good examples of that. Of course, we all have fire ant issues throughout the state of Texas. And I will say that many of the treatments for the fire ants that we have on our lawn and garden will work just fine in our beehive apiary areas as well. Spreading Amdro or Orthene around on the ground around the actual hives will inhibit those colonies from spreading into the hive and taking over. Of course, ants love sugar. A hive is full of sugar, and they will definitely invade it and cause a major problem within the hive itself. And so definitely want to be on the lookout for that. Everybody knows how to identify those mounds of fresh dirt with some of the little pinholes in them. And then, of course, the swarming ants when you disturb them. Definitely want to keep an eye out for them. One of the other things that Kyle Mintz talked about, who's our local apiary manager here in Grayson County, mammalian predators are also a problem. Many folks that have hives that are directly on the ground, if you live in an urban area or more so in a suburban area or out in the country, skunks and even black bears have been known to be major problems for many of these beehive areas. And so want to make sure that you put the hives more than 16 inches off the ground. And that allows us to be able to avoid the encounters with the skunks in particular, because their feeding range is about 0 to 16 or 18 inches from the ground surface. So if the hives are on the ground or on a very shallow type riser, then you can get the skunks to come around. They will start scratching and digging at the side of the hive. And over time, they'll start to predate within that hive itself. And each night they'll come back and get a little bit more. Bears, of course, even up here around the Red River, we're starting to have more and more black bear encounters. These are definitely a problem in beehives because Yogi and Pooh Bear are not the only bears that love the taste of honey. When they find a beehive or apiary, they will come back to that area almost every night. And so we really have to be cognizant of that. When we get clothing, it's very important for many of the hives, especially like Rachel was talking about, those that have been out in nature, and we harvest or collect those native populations, recover those and bring them back and start a hive out of them. They will be prone to get more intimidated and start to get more aggressive when you wear darker colors that resemble either a skunk or a bear. And so wearing white or very light clothing will indicate to that beehive that you are not necessarily a predator, and it will help with their aggression level. So just some kind of caveat information that I got from Mr. Kyle, and he's got about 40 years in the business of experience from north to south in Texas. So kind of a good contact to have. All right, now I get to talk about the bad guy stuff that nobody ever really likes to talk about. Unfortunately, as Rachel pointed out, there are some organic options or non-pesticidal agents that can or cannot work. What I will say is that please be aware that just because there's a fact sheet on it from the company that makes it, or because there's a commercial about it, or a magazine article about it, if it's not science-based information, we have to be very cautious about how we utilize that. You need to remember that the Environmental Protection Agency is the organization that's responsible for labeling pesticidal agents. And if they circumvent the EPA, they don't have to provide any data whatsoever behind their product concept. And there's a high likelihood that it may or may not function the way you want it to. You also have to be cognizant that it may cause more damage to the hive itself than it does to the invading species that you're trying to get rid of. So just a word of warning, the label is the law, and always read and follow the label for any pesticidal product or agent that you're utilizing. If that pesticidal product or agent does not have a label, that's a pretty good indication that it may just be an anecdotal product, and you may or may not be able to get good pesticidal effects from it for the varroa mite, for the wax moth. And so we just need to be aware of that. So that's my soapbox. I'll get down off of that now and start talking to you about one of the kind of concepts that Kyle went through with me. He likes to use a 3-year process of different agents of pesticidal form. He will start in year 1 with Apivar, and Apivar is Amitraz. That particular product is a pesticidal product. It's been around since the 1950s, and so it has a lot of good background in it. It is specifically an acaricide and to a lesser degree an insecticide, but the acari groups of insects are our mites and our ticks. And so it is fairly specific to those. And so we can utilize it in a good way and make sure that we have good coverage and utilize that. Again, the label is the law, so definitely want to make sure that you check out the treatment time and use frequency. You need to make sure that you check out how long you need to wait before you harvest any of our honey, or when exactly you should do this, whether it's when you have supers in or not. And you need to just make sure that you allow that time to elapse before you utilize any of that product. Again, these are going to be going after the varroa mite. And so this would be what Kyle uses in year 1. In year 2, of course, it's always super important to switch pesticide chemistries so that we don't develop resistance in our pest populations. And that's what we're doing here by using Apigard, which is thymol, a derivative of thymol. This is basically from thyme. It's the oil that's derived from thyme. And so it's a pesticidal agent still, but it is a little bit of a different type of pesticide. And so we're changing up chemistries to allow us to not have that development of a resistant population within these colonies. Again, make sure that you look at the time of year that you can use it. Make sure that you look at the time that you have to pull off and not utilize honey that's created in here. Make sure that you're following the label directions. And then in year 3, he will switch to one that Rachel actually talked about, which is oxalic acid. And so this one, of course, is an organic acid, and there are several different ways that it can be administered. And so there are going to be different products out there. But again, make sure that you look at the treatment time and use frequency. Make sure that you use the advantages and disadvantages to kind of talk through when and how you can utilize this product. So you also need to make sure on all of these, especially stuff like the Apigard and the Apivar, make sure that you look at those personal protective equipment needs, because many of these will require your chemical resistant gloves, which is not something you always utilize in our apiary and beekeeping service. As Rachel was talking about, they're definitely not going to be as resistant to stings, but the pesticide requires that so that you don't get the pesticidal agent onto your skin. So make sure that you're wearing the proper PPE or personal protective equipment. One other kind of different type of formic acid are the strips. And so this is another option. Kyle said whichever one is available, he'll utilize this in that oxalic or formic acid versus oxalic acid area. And just another product concept or product availability there. But again, very important for you to look at what time of year to use it in, and also some of those considerations as far as honey production, and look forward to that. Okay, so that's just on mostly the varroa mite. Of course, many of the products that we're going to use for the wax moth and other species that are even more closely related to our honeybees are going to be very specific as to how and when we use those, because many of them, depending on how we administer those, may have an impact on the hive itself. Integrated pest management is one way that we can try to minimize the amount of pesticides that we actually use. Many of you may be aware of what IPM is, but I'm going to just talk briefly about why we need it and what it is. So we know for sure that within the beehive realm, our production loss and loss of those colonies can be super significant. And then, of course, that impacts the available food for human consumption, whether it's in our local garden where we have our pollinators at, or whether it's across the globe. And the more beehive decline we see, the more colony collapse we see, the more important it is for us to try to utilize all these different tools. So when we look at modern agriculture, there's a big difference between what we used to do historically over time, eras ago, and what we do now. Now we're very reliant on monocultures. We have a very genetically uniform cultivar of cotton or whatever it is that we're growing. We have a high use of fertilizers and irrigation where it's available. And then we transport these products from state to state and across state lines very frequently. And so that just creates more and more potential opportunity for us to have a transfer of pests for sure. When we talk about pest outbreaks, of course, many of these pests will ebb and flow over time. And sometimes you're going to get to a threshold very quickly. Sometimes you may just have a few of these pests in the environment. I will say that varroa mites in particular, one is kind of the threshold, so you really have to be on the watch out for it. And then many of the pests in their normal environment would have normal natural enemies that would keep that pest population at bay. But again, like I said, when we took honeybees out of the natural environment and put them into a apiary or a beehive, we have changed the dynamic of their environment. And so we need to be cognizant that we have changed that environment. We have changed the natural enemies. Now, if a pest gets in there, the pest can no longer get to the mite. And now we have a really big problem on our hand. We also need to make sure, just as we discussed a little bit ago, use the correct pesticides in the right way, in the right time. And then destruction of those natural communities of a lot of these different insects have really led to some of these outbreaks as well. I'm not going to get real deep into the math, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about the balance of nature and the fact that many times some of these different populations may or may not get to a treatment threshold. Again, with the apiary world, we want to definitely be on it almost all the time. So this may not hold true here, but just in the grand scheme of integrated pest management, many times we can decrease the use of pesticides because we don't necessarily have to treat for these populations. If we see one armyworm, for instance, in a Bermuda grass field, we may not necessarily need to treat the entire field for armyworms. And so we can hold back on that pyrethrin type insecticide that does have very detrimental effects on our bee colonies around that general area. When we think about IPM, we want to use many of those different management techniques, sanitation, quarantines. We want to use the right pesticide at the right time. And we want to use it in a fashion that minimizes the economic threshold or economic injury that occurs in that hive or in that apiary. Within that, we can try to keep that hive from falling apart. We can try to minimize the long-term damage to that hive. Really, I'm just going to touch briefly on this slide and move to the next one. But the economic injury level is actually that level at which basically the injury is more so than the profit that you're going to get off of that crop, off of that beehive, the honey production or otherwise. And so we really have to watch that. What we want to try to do is time that management tool to before we hit the economic injury level. So we're going to call that action threshold of when we put that into place. But again, we're still having a major impact on that pest population, and hopefully we can decrease its effectiveness and its spread throughout our colonies at the best way possible. So first, we need to make sure we know what pest we have. We need to make sure we can identify a mite versus just a general insect that might be in the hive. We need to make sure that we can identify American foul brood versus other types of foul brood. We need to make sure that we can identify correctly what that population size is as well. And we need to be inspecting all of these hives to make sure that we have the correct determination of where we have that economic threshold for sure. We also need to know what some of the control measures that are appropriate are. Of course, within all of the pesticidal agents, we have biological type controls, we have cultural type controls. These are going to be very, very important when we talk about beehives and beehive production because that sanitation, the weed control even, and some of the resistance management are all very important within this realm. And then, of course, at both the state and government levels, we will look at any of these quarantines or any of these types of like American foul brood being reported to the Texas apiary system. We want to make sure that we have exactly what we need in place. We do have quite a few different control measures from the hormonal side on some of these insects, not necessarily in the beehive world, but we do many times have to fall back on chemical controls, whether those are organic chemicals or synthetic, to be able to get the pest controlled. Like we were talking about earlier, if we use ones that are strictly acaricides for the varroa mite, or we'll actually just get some of our different species are very specific, that can help us out in the long run for sure. So what types of habitat do we have? Similar to what Brittany was talking about, what all is in that habitat, what are its feeding habits, chemical susceptibility of that population, and then reproductive potential for sure as well. What I want to make sure that everybody understands is that going back to the agricultural questions and the agricultural discussion, we, even in the agricultural world, have to monitor exactly how much insecticide we use because we absolutely know that insects are pivotal to the environment. Without them, without many of our pollinators, we would collapse. We as a society would collapse. And so it's important for us to understand that just as much as beekeepers want to. We want to make sure that when we control a pest, we don't have a secondary pest outbreak. We want to make sure that we protect our pollinators at all costs. And that can be something as simple as having pesticides that don't leave a residue, environmental contaminations as well. So just a few species that I wanted to point out where we're going to look at integrated pest management for these species. Mechanical control for the small hive beetle. Placing hives in sunny, well-ventilated areas can decrease that humidity and actually make it an environment that the larva of that beetle can't survive in. And so that can be a mechanical way to do it. Using hygienic stock for that requeening process is very important as well to get that hive as healthy and productive as possible. Introducing nematodes that are specific to the beetle and will not mess with the bees themselves are a potential. And then when needed, using chemical controls that are available on the market, both the in-hive strip that we were talking about. We also have ground drenches that can be placed around the hive as well. But realize that many of our chemical controls are not perfect. And so implementing many of these tools together can be a much better option at stopping that invasion than using one single one by itself. For the varroa mite, of course, there's a wealth of information out there on this one. There is no silver bullet, unfortunately, but folks like the Honeybee Health Coalition have developed a lot of cool management tools that can be utilized to pick the right control measure or measures to be able to utilize this. We have monitoring, we have cultural and mechanical controls. We have rotation of chemicals like we talked about to try to prevent that mite resistance. Many times, I think Rachel even talked about it, that sometimes we start to see those mites be less and less impacted by the different control mechanisms that we utilize. The more we can switch out those methods and use different chemistries and different environmental controls, the better off we're going to be for sure. So my job is not only to talk about pests of the bees themselves, but the reality that we know that pesticides are going to be used in the environment, and how can we, as stewards of the land, do better to help the pollinators in general. A couple of different keys here. Always read and follow the pesticide labels for rate, timing, and tank mixes. And please make sure that you understand I'm switching gears now from the apiary manager and the person who's in charge of controlling the pests of the bees to I am now talking with our agricultural managers, and could be pasture land management, could be a cropping field, could be forestry, any of those realms where we are going to be utilizing pesticides. These are just some common sense things that we try to do on a regular basis that I want to make sure you're aware about, that we try to avoid impacting those pollinators. Always read and follow those labels, because if you get the wrong rate or if you get the wrong timing, there's a high potential that you're going to have an impact on those pollinators and those non-target plants that we don't want to mess with than what we would if we use the label product per its labeled use. Definitely for any of our weed control, of course, herbicides are going to be fairly specific to the plants themselves, but we can have some direct and or indirect impacts from those pesticides, those herbicides, on the pollinator species. Most of our weeds that we need to get control of, we try to spray before they have flowers on them. That in and of itself will negate any kind of bee presence for the most part, and utilizing localized sprays like an individual plant treatment or just spraying portions of the pasture at a time will minimize that overall large impact that you're having on the pollinator species in general. Avoid pesticide applications to crop fields in flower. Almost all of our newer pesticide labels will now prohibit application timing at the flowering stage. There are a few exceptions for different either specific insecticides or specific fungicides that key in on that flowering time or the seed production time, but most of those say to avoid the flower and wait till seed pod development, or do it prophylactically on the front end before the flower emerges. We're trying to minimize that impact to the pollinators. Avoid pesticide applications during active pollinator times of the day. We know for sure that most of the time, honeybees and other native bees and many of our pollinators are not active really early in the morning. They're not active at night, and they're usually really peak time is in that hotter part of the day. Well, that coincides great with the time that we normally recommend folks spraying pesticides. Most of the time we recommend a very early morning spray before the winds come up, before the heat gets too much, and we recommend also trying to do late evening applications for some of our pesticides, but we very rarely talk about spraying when the sun's out, the wind's up, and those pollinators are out there. We try to avoid that at all costs. Many times, many of our herbicides are fairly benign to pollinator populations once the pesticide has dried onto the plant. There are a few exceptions to that, of course, but the toxicity in general is minimized when we can allow that drying time before the pollinators come out. Again, avoid applying pesticides to standing water. That is a big, big no-no in pesticide application in general, but I will iterate, like Brittany and Rachel have talked about before, water is absolutely necessary for these pollinators and these honeybees, and it's imperative that we avoid getting pesticide into those. We also just in general try to minimize drift from these applications. There are a lot of different components, from surfactants to drift retarding agents, that you can add to sprays to make sure that that spray only goes to the target that you're looking at. And then one thing that Kyle Mintz talked about was if you have a pest population that does have a lot of flowers on it, or sorry, a weed population that does have a lot of flowers on it, mow the flowers off before you spray the fields. And that's just to minimize the attraction of those fields to the pollinators themselves. So really, these are some information, and I'm going to pass this presentation on to Jacqueline to allow you all to have in PDF form. But there's just a whole lot of information on here about integrated pest management, particularly related to American foul brood and varroa mite. But there's also some contact information there to report American foul brood if you need to. Good hygiene, good hygiene, good hygiene. That is the most important thing for sure. And then really making sure that we have the ability to use frames that are clean. If we're going to reuse frames, we need to make sure that those have been cleaned and sterilized. Make sure that you get good genetic lines of honeybees to make sure that that hive itself, that colony itself, is the most productive and healthy that it can be. And that's going to be a big part of it as well. Monitoring, monitoring, monitoring. I know that Rachel talked about it, but if you come into a train wreck, it is very, very difficult to manage that. If you come in and catch an invasion or an infestation on the front end, it's a lot easier to manage for sure. So with that, just in closing summary to say that we as an agricultural organization are here because the pollinators are here, and we absolutely value them for sure. Thank you all for your time, and I will definitely open it up for any questions if you have any. If we have time, I guess. Jacqueline, can you hear me?
I can hear you. I am not seeing any questions
All
in the
right.
chat box.
Just want to
So-
make sure I hadn't got kicked off again and just spent the last 45 minutes talking to air. So,
No, you're good. You're good.
all right.
All right, thanks, Chad. So with that being said, we will jump into the last presentation of the day of how beekeeping can qualify for ag valuation on property taxes. So can everybody see my screen?
Yes, ma'am.
Perfect, thank you. And well, let's see. Well, I'm having difficulties here. Hold on. So. Okay. So. The law for the ag valuation became in the Texas Tax Code, Chapter 23, and it all became effective January 1 in 2012. So, and what the law states is the term agricultural use also includes the use of the land to raise or keep bees for pollination or for the production of human food or other tangible products having a commercial value, provided that the land used is not less than 5 acres or more than 20 acres. So a lot of the time with your ag valuations, it is going to vary differently in each county, with the exception of the bees. So as it states here, the state went in and put the parameters in terms of the amount of acreage, minimum to max, that can be used. So with this, what you end up getting is land will not be valued at the market value when calculating your property taxes. Land will be valued at agriculture productivity value when calculating your taxes. So it'll be at a much lower rate versus the market value. And what your appraisal districts are looking for when you start looking at this is not only the land itself, but it's the land, the roads, ponds, fences that are used for agricultural production. Whereas your buildings or improvements, all of those are going to be valued at market value. The active engagement with agriculture activity, the principal use of the land has to be agriculture in order for it to be maintained under your ag valuation. And in this instance, beekeeping has to be the primary use of the land. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't continue to have a hay production aspects of things or run livestock or anything like that. You can. It just means that the primary portion of things has to be beekeeping. The degree of intensity has to be similar to what is found in the rest of the county. And again, those parameters are going to be set by the Central Appraisers District. Devoted to beekeeping for 5 out of the last 7 years outside the city limits. So what that means is if you've bought a piece of property and you have applied for your ag valuation, then you have to go in and you have to devote the 5 of the 7 years, you have to show bee activity on it. And the other aspects of it, you have to file the valid application on time, and that is generally before April 30th of each year. How many hives are required? This is your degree of intensity. Again, this is going to be established on a count. This portion of it will be established on a county by county basis. And it's going to depend on what your Central Appraisers District sets. And it's not the same for every county, but the question is, why? Well, when you look at the state of Texas in general and looking at this map, when you go from east to west, all of the various colors within this map are your annual, average annual rain precipitation. This is in inches. So what we use over here in kind of southeast Texas, what that intensity level is going to be way different than what's over here in El Paso. Just based on the rain. And when we don't have the rain or the water, we don't have the pollinators, we don't have the flowers, everything has got to go further in terms for pollination. So that's where the degree of intensity kind of starts coming into play. Here's some examples of requirements. Taylor County, minimum of 6 hives for 5 to 10 acres, 7 hives for 10 to 15, or 8 hives for the 15 to 20. And as you look down this list, it changes. And again, based on all of this is set within the Central Appraisers District. But if you look at, but the one thing that is consistent is your acreage. Callahan County, which is about an hour, 2 hours west here of Fort Worth, the requirements on the land must be a minimum of 5 mainframe hives. The degree of intensity is defined as 1 mainframe hive per acre. Hives must be maintained according to standard beekeeping practices, and inspection must be conducted by the appraisal district at least annually to ensure compliance with these standards. So just as with any type of ag valuation, once you apply for it, you have the conversations with the Central Appraisers District in order to make sure that the landowner is doing what is needed. Don't be surprised that somebody from the Central Appraisers District would go out to inspect the areas. What value do appraisal districts use when appraising the land? Your land can be designated as agricultural use by the appraiser district when keeping bees. As we've already established, but going back with everything, there are other agricultural aspects that can be used with it as well. The appraised value of the land varies by the appraisal district. Note that the length of time, the duration, hives must remain on the property each year can vary from different appraisal districts. So as what Rachel was saying earlier in her presentation, we look at the time, how active the bees are, when they're in production, and so forth. Well, the Central Appraisers District, they know this, they understand this, so then they can go in knowing this and say, okay, those hives have to be on the property for X amount of time, you have to be producing, and et cetera. So some of the examples for these requirements, going back to Taylor County again, the productivity per acre is the same as a value for native pasture. And again, what that kind of means and what we're looking at there is depending on the county that you're in, There may be a valuation on native pasture versus improved pasture. Your native pastures are going to be those grasses such as your blue stems, your grama grasses, anything that has been there and we have not physically replaced. Your improved grasses are going to be such in terms of your Bermuda grasses. So in Taylor County, the productivity value per acre is the same as what it is for a native pasture, but those hives have to be out there for a minimum of 7 months each year. And again, here's just a couple of more examples. Going back to Callahan County, the same value as dry cropland. In that county, I can tell you that there is not a whole lot of water in that county. So everything in terms of crops, hay production, whatever is going on in that county, there's not any irrigation. So everything is having to rely on rainfall, which is what we would call dry cropland. And again, the duration would be 7 months. But if you go down here and you look at Reynolds County, wasn't able to find anything as far as productivity value of the per acre, but for the duration, it's at least one active mainframe hive year round. So when you start looking at the ag valuation and pieces of your property, I would highly encourage you, call your central appraisers district, visit with them, find out what the requirements are for having bees for your ag valuation, or call your local extension office. They can help point you in the right direction as well. Additional rules for some of the appraiser district have to show you are buying bees. So yes, if you can catch a swarm, great. But a lot of the time with your appraisal districts, when you start looking at your ag valuations on things, they want to keep records. If they want you to keep records. If they are needing or wanting you to produce receipts that you have bought some of this, you need to be able to produce it. You have to be able to show that you are also selling honey. So it's not just having them out there in order to, okay, I've applied for it, I've got them out there, now I don't have to do anything with it. No, you have to show that you are at least in some type of profit loss production aspects. They may even require pictures of your active bees. Taking pictures or a quick video of your beehives and emailing it in when prompted. That works. They will also do site inspections. Appraisers know that bees get active when it starts swarming up, which, as Rachel stated in her presentation, that's starting April. So as we go through, and if your appraiser district knows that you are beekeeping and you have the minimum acreage and this is what you've applied for your ag valuation on, they're gonna want, especially in your first five of your first 7 years, they're gonna want to show or see that things are happening. Other requirements that have been seen in Texas, some counties do require registration with the Texas Apiary Inspection Service. This can also be through your AgriLife research aspects of things. Submit a landscape plan of the property. Indicate how different plantings, this is your fruit trees, your shrubs, your vines, flowers, clovers, buckwheats, etc., contribute to bee foraging. So that plan that Brittany was talking about, or the various plants that she was talking about in creating that habitat, sit down and create where you're going to have your hives, and within a quarter to a half a mile, need to make sure that you have a water source, but you have a food source for them as well. The more that you can do, the easier it makes dealing with the Central Appraisers District when it comes to ag valuations. And I'm sure there are more other requirements that I haven't been able to find across the state. One thing to consider with that 5 acres, if you have a house on that property, 9 times out of 10, the appraisal district is going to withhold acreage for that house as a homestead. Some counties that can be 1 acre, some counties that can be 2. So an example for easy math on this, as an example, if your county requires 1 acre for a homestead, and then the county and the state requires 5 acres for bees, you would need a total of 6 acres in order to qualify to hit the minimum of what it would take to have an ag valuation with bees. So it's a total of 6 acres in this example. But don't be surprised if as time progresses and more people are using bees in terms of for their ag valuations, that more requirements are going to be put into place. Currently, right now, Ag Code Chapter 131 with the various subsections, these are the ones that are currently in place now. Section 131.045 is your beekeeper registration. Each beekeeper in this state may register on an annual basis with a chief apiary inspector. A registration under this section expires August 31st. The following date, the registration is issued. I'm not exactly sure. I've had a hard time, and I'm looking to try to figure out exactly how all that works. But the registration must include information required by the chief apiary inspector and the county or counties in which the beekeeper operates. The inspector may require a beekeeper to submit with the registration information a map showing the exact location of each of the beekeeper's apiaries. Ag Code Section 131.061, identification required. Except as provided in subsection B, a person may not operate an apiary in this state unless the hives are clearly and permanently marked with the name of the person as provided in another section. Branded in accordance with the same section, with a brand registered to the person by the chief apiary inspector, or identified by a weatherproofing sign posted within the apiary containing the name and contact information of the brand number of the persons managing the apiary, printed in lettering at least 1 inch high. The apiary at the principal residence of the beekeeper is exempt from the requirements of subsection A. And here's the subsection, the 131.064, which was mentioned in the previous, is a manner of affixating a name or brand to the hives. Must be affixed to the hive by burning, pressing, painting, or otherwise permanently marking the name or brand. In figures in at least 1/2 of an inch high into the wood or other material in the manner that it shows the identification of the hive. The name or brand must be affixated on one or both sides of a hive. A lot of this is kind of common sense in an instant, guys, because if something happens, hives are knocked over, if something happens with your apiary, at least people will be able to get back a hold of you on things. Well, here's kind of another turn of events. So what if I don't want to actually do the work? Well, I've got a piece of property. It qualifies and it meets that minimum 5 to 20 acres for ag exemption or ag valuation. And I don't want to do anything with it, but I know somebody else might want to, and I can reap the benefits of the ag valuations, and then somebody else can benefit from using my land. Well, what can I do? Well, you can lease your property to somebody wanting to raise bees that doesn't necessarily have the land. May need to get them to provide a special notice or other information from the Central Appraiser District stating their intents and intensity levels and plans. This actually works out really great, guys, in terms of beekeepers such as Rachel. So if she's wanting to expand her apiary into areas that she doesn't necessarily have access to or whatnot, but she knows a friend of a friend who has some property that would work very well for an apiary situation, working with that property owner on a lease type basis where both parties are benefited from it, is a great partnership and something that is seen very much in the ag industry today. But I can very, very much and will stress that old adage of good fences make good neighbors. The same thing goes here. Good property leases make good neighbors. Where can you find some of the lease information? The Texas Beekeepers Association has some links to some leases, and I do know that the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension in Taylor County also has some links to some property leases to help with beekeeping. Some other things to consider, especially when dealing with your central appraiser districts, don't just do the minimum. If you end up doing just the minimum, at some point in time, you're gonna get laxed and, well, I don't have to do this. I haven't been caught. And then as soon as you take one step in the wrong direction, here comes your central appraisers district. Appraiser districts will look at all of your activities. Make sure you're not just trying to take the easy road. Will be easy to do since you have the pollinators rather than harvesting honey. So I mean, just make sure you have a combination of the both. Go above and beyond. Just don't give your central appraisers district a reason to question you on your operation. As long as you have the minimum required acreage, beehives for your county, you have a good management plan in terms of your water source, your pollinators, your food source for them. And then at some point in time, as you are moving into the honey production for it, just make sure you have all of that together. That way you can show your central appraisers district, hey, I am doing everything possible moving forward with things. Even if you have that property leased to somebody and somebody else is doing all the work, make sure that the central appraisers district has a copy of that lease moving forward with things. So kind of in conclusion, beekeeping is an alternative for earning your agricultural use, your ag exemption. It reduces your property tax liability significantly. But what I can tell you with this is once you get it, don't lose it. Because if you lose your ag exemption or your ag valuation on your property, whether you sell it or whether it's laxed and you don't keep up with it, a buyer, are going to be liable for the rollback taxes of the last 3 years. And that is not something that you want to deal with. So make sure that you keep on top of this. If anything changes with things, make sure that you are in contact with your central appraisers district. It's a whole lot easier to have that conversation up front moving forward than trying to scramble and kind of come up with something on the back end. And remember, each appraisers district has their own requirements, so be sure to check with your local appraisers district on things. Beekeeping for the pollination or harvesting of honeycombs and honey, it works great, but just be sure that you are going above and beyond with things for your central appraisers district. Make sure you know what the minimums are and then go above and beyond from there. And that is all I have on this. So I know Brittany has posted the survey that we had talked about at the beginning of the program in the chat box for everyone. Please remember that in order to gain your CEUs, you must fill out the survey. I do need your name as well as your pesticide license number. If I do not have that, I cannot get you your CEU certificate and credit for that. So please be sure to fill that out. If you are here for the information and not needing the CEUs in those blanks, please just put NA and complete the survey for us. It would be greatly appreciated. Part of our job is to make sure that we are reporting back to the state stakeholders as well as our county commissioners on programs that we are offering. And these surveys are a great way to help us make sure that we are providing to you the information that you are needing and looking for. Again, for the CEUs, this program was recorded. However, in order to receive your CEU, you had to be on the live version of the presentation today. The recording of this, give me a little time. I will be posting it on the Tarrant AgriLife YouTube page later in the week. That way you'll be able to go and review the information at a later time, but give me a little time. It takes a little bit in order to get it on there. My goal is to have it on there by Friday. Once that is completed, I will send the link, email the link out to everyone that was registered for the program today. At this time, do we have any questions for any of the presenters?
Looks like we have a couple of questions in there. I'm not sure if Brittany or Rachel would be the right one to answer this one. Are there any requirements on yield from the hives? And I'm assuming to meet the Central Appraisal District numbers, is that correct?
Yes. Okay. That is going to be on a county by county basis. As when we looked at the presentation in some of those counties, the value of the yield was going to be based on the value of what a native pasture was. Some counties are going to put a specific dollar amount. There are a couple of that stated you had to produce $800 worth of honey, for instance. But that is, again, once you have your hives up in production on things. But again, in order to verify that, check with your Central Appraisers District.
And then one other question from Darren is, we're supposed to check the hives every 10 to 14 days. How often do you actually find something during one of those inspections that requires action? And will there eventually be something wrong with every hive at some point during the year? And then lastly, or can you go weeks or months or years without finding anything requiring some sort of remediation? Rachel or Brittany, maybe?
So Darren, the reason you're going out and checking 10 to 14 days, it's better to find nothing wrong than go a month or two and then come out to a dead hive. So you're wanting to check as often as possible to make sure nothing does go wrong. Or if you do catch something, you're catching it early to where it's minimal action required and not, again, having a completely dead hive or something else. And you can go years if everything is going well and you have adequate support for your bees, the habitat and everything with nothing going wrong, but it's better to find something before it's catastrophic.
And I believe that's all the questions we have. And it looks like, Darren, that answered your question? Okay. I'm not sure if Jacqueline's still there or not.
I am, if I learn to take myself.
You just put yourself back on mute.
Me and this computer are gonna go round and round today. So, but again, I have posted the link for the survey once again in the chat box. Again, if everybody would take a few minutes to fill that out, we would greatly appreciate it. Thank you for joining us. I know today was a long program. We hope that you enjoyed it. We hope you got something out of it today. And we're looking forward to seeing y'all at some of our other programs further down the line. So with that being said, again, thank you for joining us, and we will call it an afternoon.